starvation does a lot very quickly. And so if you're starved, or if you're on, as I described in the book, a fasting mimicking diet, the system detects it as a complete starvation period, and so it reacts to that. And one of the reactions is to start breaking down fat. And the other reaction is to start starting to break down tissues. And so with autoimmune cells, for example, with cancer cells, the damaged cells, there are these differential responses, right? The cancer cells dies, the normal cells is protected. The autoimmune cell dies, the immune cells eventually regenerate, and they are better than before. So yeah, there are differential effects.
Hello and welcome back. It's Mike Mutzel with HighIntensityHealth.com. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for being here. I'm always grateful. There's so many podcasts and videos and stuff to listen to out there. So if you're watching these videos, if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, I'm really grateful for that. Today we catch up with Dr. Valter Longo, the author of a new great book called The Longevity Diet, which I posted the show notes and also links to the book that you can purchase through Amazon in this YouTube description. Now, normally, as you know, if you've been following us for any length of time, we do in-person video interviews. This was a Zoom video, and so it's side by side, you know, how Zoom works. I think it turned out pretty well. I had to do a lot of post-production stuff because for some reason the audio drifts and you have to resync it. It's kind of a pain in the butt, but hopefully your viewing experience will be good. I think you'll enjoy the content. A few, kind of personal sound bites that I wanted to throw in here. One thing that, as we record this in January, one thing I've noticed when I watch my dogs, watch my chickens, watch any animal that doesn't have the modern conveniences that we have of 24/7 access to food and Uber Eats and all that sort of thing, animals tend to eat earlier in the day and fast for longer periods of time. So I think the content of this discussion is definitely very pertinent to this time of year as we post this January 9th or something, so early January. So in the winter, ancestral humans, unindustrialized people, because daylight is short and there's predators and danger being out at night, we compress our feeding window. And you're gonna learn about the adaptive physiologic responses associated with compressing your feeding window and mimicking starvation, and how the body can kind of clean itself up. It's a natural repair mechanism, as you heard in the introduction. And we go on to talk about challenges and problems, and really challenging the idea that we need excessive amounts of protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Valter talks a lot about this and how after the age of 65, we may need a little bit more protein, but under that period of time, excessive protein may not serve us very well. So that's what's coming up. The show notes are below. You can always fast forward this video, to the points in time that you're very interested in learning a little bit more about. And as always, this episode is sponsored and proudly sponsored by Somnifix, the world's first and only hypoallergenic mouth tape. As you may know, when you're breathing through your mouth while you're in deep phases of sleep, your tongue collapses on your airway, and it creates a mild hypoxic event. So Somnifix is an awesome product, and we're huge fans of Somnifix because it makes the practice of mouth taping so much easier, increases compliance, and decreases adverse responses like peeling off tape in the morning and having it stick to your mouth. So definitely check out the link below, learn more about Somnifix, definitely try mouth taping. It will improve your sleep and your productivity in 2018 and beyond. So let's dive into it with Valter.
Coming on, Valter, I know you're really busy in the middle of a book launch and everything like that. I would love to just kind of first start off with what academic or scientific publications kind of got you down this journey to look at longevity and calorie restriction and maybe protein restriction. And was it serendipitous, or was there some early mentor that kind of steered you down this direction?
No, I actually, that's all I've ever done. So since I was 19, as an undergraduate in Texas, I started studying aging. I think it was my sophomore year, and that's all I've ever done since. And, that was 30 years ago. So a couple of years ago, actually about 10 years ago, I started thinking about writing a book. But then I never published it, the older version, and I waited until this version, and I felt, this was a good, in part because we also have published on clinical data. And that was important, but also published on an epidemiological study. So I think all of the things that I talk about in the book has been very important before telling people what to do. I think it's unfortunately in most cases it's very improvised advices.
One of the conferences that you spoke at last year was the Metabolic Therapeutics Conference, and I heard you speak at, I think it was February 1st of 2017 in Tampa, Florida. You talked about the high prevalence of a growth hormone receptor, and GNR4, I can't remember the exact receptor, in South America. Was that, and these individuals were of very short stature, but yet they didn't have a high prevalence of age-related diseases. Was that epidemiological finding what led you to make the connection between accelerated aging and growth hormone and cancer and protein intake and that sort of thing?
Yes, I mean, this is really at the center of the book, and the reason why we study this LARON, they have a mutation in the receptor of the growth hormone. The reason for that was that we had identified this super long-lived yeast, Baker's yeast, and they were dwarf. And then John Kapchik and Andrei Barkey had shown that mice that had the mutation in the growth hormone receptor, they had record longevity. They could live normally 50% longer, but also be super healthy, a lot less cancer and protection from diabetes, etc. So so then eventually about 10 years ago, I started wondering, or 12, 13 years ago, I started wondering about humans. What about people that had mutation in these longevity genes that we and others were identifying? And so we started working with Jaime Guevara in Ecuador and this population. So the equivalent, the human equivalent to the mice that have this record longevity. They may not live a lot longer, but they certainly seem to be protected from cancer and diabetes and probably cognitive decline. So their brain seems to be working more like that of people that are younger.
And so the mechanisms there, we hear a lot about when it comes to slowing down the aging process, things like telomeres and telomerase and things along those lines. But how does the growth hormone receptor and the whole insulin axis, how does that fit in from a mechanistic standpoint to ameliorating or slowing down the onset of these age-related chronic diseases that you mentioned, the diabetes, cognitive decline, cancer? What are the connections there? Or is there any connections between these quote-unquote anti-aging metabolic pathways?
Yes, of course. I mean, there is only one aging, and and you can control it or help regulate it by genetic intervention, so intervening on the genes, or you can do it by nutritional interventions. And so what we had identified already, a couple of decades ago or more, is there are at least two pathways, two sets of genes. One is regulated by proteins, and one is regulated by sugar. And together, if the sugar and the proteins are there, or certainly certain amino acids are there, then these genes are turned on. They're very active, and when they're very active, the cell and the organism ages more quickly, and and develops more mutation in the DNA, and becomes dysfunctional and quicker, and loses, for example, the ability to reproduce. And so then the nutrients control the genes, which controls the protection of the cell. And lately, in the last 5 years or so, we started showing not only does it control the protection of the cell, it also controls the rejuvenation of the cell. So now, by having these genes on, the stem cells are kept in a standby state, and regeneration is blocked, right? So there's plenty of food. The system doesn't regenerate, and so so that's another major factor, is the effect of these genes, the nutrients, the genes on regeneration.
So I want to underscore something that you said and just make sure that I understood properly. You said when there's plenty of fuel on board, the system doesn't regenerate, and that kind of ties into this intermittent fasting, calorie restriction model that you've been publishing in the academic world for some time. So in periods of nutrient restriction or calorie restriction for a short duration of time, the cells and the tissues can regenerate better than if there's a lot of energy on board. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, more than calorie restriction is really starvation. You know, and calorie restriction doesn't do much, especially if it's done for a few days. But starvation does a lot very quickly. And so if you're starved, or if you're on, as I described in the book, a fasting mimicking diet, the system detects it as a complete starvation period. And so it reacts to that. And one of the reaction is to start breaking down fat. And the other reaction is to start preparing, well, starting to break down tissues. And so, you know, cells of the liver will break down, muscle cells will break down. So almost everything breaks down in one way or another. And the inside of a cell starts breaking down by autophagy. So the systems really, I always talk about a train, a wood burning train that is running out of fuel. And I talk about that in the book. And I say, well, at some point, to get to the next train station, you burn your own parts, right? So you burn your own chairs and you burn your own walls. And because the priority is to make it to the next train station. Now, you probably pick the ones that, if you were the owner of the train, you probably pick the ones that are most damaged, right, first. And then you pick everything eventually. Then you get to the train station, to the next fueling station, and you can fuel, but also rebuild the train, right? So I think it makes sense also because there's not many other ways of doing it. If you think about it, it would be pretty stupid after 3 billions of years of evolution not to do that, right? It makes sense, but it also makes evolutionary sense. And so it's exactly what happens, and it works very well.
So the idea is that when we're doing the fasting mimicry diet or intermittent calorie restriction and so forth, we're taking the weaker cells that may be problematic and contributing to the aging process, and we're, you know, engulfing them and eating them, using them as fuel. But maybe the stronger cells, you know, the healthier cells are not eaten up. Is that kind of what, I mean, using very non-scientific terms here, is that kind of what you were saying?
Yes, we began to show that with autoimmune cells, for example, with cancer cells. The damaged cells, there are these differential responses, right? The cancer cells dies, the normal cells is protected. The autoimmune cell dies, the immune cells eventually regenerate, and they are better than before. So yeah, there are differential effects. And of course, you know, we're only beginning to demonstrate in humans, but in mice it's very clear. And I doubt that this is something that is specific for simpler organisms or simpler mammals. I think it's just a very fundamental property of all organisms. We saw, you know, starvation benefiting bacteria, benefiting yeast, worms, flies. Well, flies not so much, you know, actually. So one of the exceptions maybe flies. But yeah, most organisms benefit at least temporarily by starvation, and so this is likely to be very much a conserved mechanism.
And very interesting. I'd love to kind of drill down a little bit more on the mechanisms and applications. But outside of that town in Ecuador that you mentioned, if we can go back and look at this through the lens of evolution, you know, it makes sense that there was periods of feast and famine and things of those sorts. What other cultures have you looked at, or maybe your colleagues have looked at, that naturally, you know, the ebb and flow of calorie intake and then calorie restriction due to food availability? I mean, how is this woven into our genome and our epigenome? I mean, was this part of humankind before the advent of refrigeration and mass food production and so forth?
Well, there is no doubt that most organisms starve most of the time. And, you know, this is true for bacteria and all the microorganisms. Now, for humans, how frequent was starvation or, you know, at least not having food? Probably very frequent. It was probably most of the time, meaning that we probably didn't eat very often. And and so having long periods of no food intake at all were probably it was probably very common, and and so obviously it makes sense that we will have ways to deal with it, and we will also use it to do as much as possible. And I think probably starvation was something similar to sleeping. You use it to sort of recuperate. Now, I'm not an expert on sleeping, but I think the emerging data is suggesting that it's not just a time to rest; it's also time to do some repair, and so probably starvation represented a time to repair and replace. And of course, by eating all the time, in an obsessed way, then we probably now start getting rid of this very important tool. Maybe not that much differently than if we didn't sleep, or certainly if we started sleeping a lot less. I mean, you can imagine how we could eliminate sleep if we really wanted to, and probably not such a good idea. And so now we eliminated fasting, and that's also probably not such a good idea.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, what you were talking about is, I think a lot of this is industry driven. If we look at the fitness industry and the food industry, the main ethos is you need to constantly have fuel in the system to prevent breakdown, and have protein shakes every 3 hours and things like that for weight loss. And I know a focal point of your studies has looked at protein intake and associated with, accelerated aging and cancer and various things. So what is the link there between dietary protein? Is it certain protein sources, animal protein versus vegetarian protein, or just protein in general, that kind of accelerates this aging process and time on Earth, if you will?
Yeah. Well, first of all, and that's really the focus of my book, it's complicated, meaning that we like for everything to be simple, right? And for some reason, if you take a computer, it's not simple. I mean, if you try to design the software, it's not simple. But with food, we like it to be simple. And I remember when we first published on protein and the effect of protein on being both good and bad, there was a popular TV show, and the doctor on the show said, this is too complicated. Low protein helped people under the age of 65 and hurt the people over the age of 65. Well, guess what? It's just, that's the way it is, right? And we just cannot simplify it. And the simplification is made tremendous damage of saying, this is good, this is bad, fat is good, and it's bad. And sugars, carbohydrates first were good, now they're bad. It just is silly, right? And of course, and most people, like now we have this attack on carbohydrate, but people forget that our body functions on carbohydrates, right? I mean, our whole system is based on glycolysis. So now proteins appear to be excess protein, is especially associated with the North American diet, seem to be very bad up to age 65, meaning that the people that reported having over 20% of the calories coming from protein up to age 65, and in the years following, they did very poorly for cancer, for overall mortality, and probably for diabetes. And but after age 65, the people reporting having a very low protein intake, they seem to be doing worse, right? And now it's tricky because there's never been an era in the United States where like an extremely low protein diet was viewed as being good, right? So there is no population in the US that you could follow, say, oh, I followed a low protein diet because I was trying to be healthier, right? And that represents a problem because most people reporting low protein are probably frail, sick, maybe in nursing homes, et cetera, et cetera. So, that is probably a complicated answer for why low protein is not so good for the elderly. Although one of the reasons is IGF-1. We've shown that after a certain age, this growth factor, which is increased by protein, and is central in aging, in the aging process. After a certain age, it goes down. And so we've shown in the paper that low protein and high protein didn't make much of a difference for people that were older on IGF-1 levels, right? So that may be part of the explanation that these growth factors, as we've seen for the Larons, for the Ecuadorian people, are so important for aging, to accelerate aging. But at a certain point, when you're old, they become so low that having a high protein diet no longer imposes a major problem. So proteins control growth factor, growth hormone, which controls IGF-1, which also control TOR, and carbohydrates control pKa, and together they seem to do, again, two things: accelerate aging and block or inhibit regeneration.
So, I personally struggle mentally with this from a couple different perspectives, and I think a lot of our listeners would agree. We hear so much about muscle tissue and skeletal muscle and having lean body mass and strength, and how that's protective in combating, longevity and living independently as we get older. Yet we know that protein and muscle protein synthesis are key factors that help to maintain lean muscle mass, right? So where can you help us, for the athletic crowd, people that are physically active, that do yoga, CrossFit, weightlifting, etc., for health purposes? How should we be viewing protein differently than obviously than the fitness industry wants us to have protein shakes every 3 hours, which we know is not good. But I mean, having steak periodically, having eggs. I mean, should we be oscillating this and undulating our intake, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, we're studying that right now at the University of Verona. So we have a clinical trial ongoing for like athletes, and both we're going to look at muscle strength and a few other things. So we don't know yet, but the suspicion is that you have to have enough proteins in the regeneration part. So when you refeed, or when you feed and you train, you have to have 30 grams of protein and a certain amount of certain amino acids. So otherwise, the system, TOR is not activated, and the system doesn't build muscle mass. But at the same time, probably having too much all the time may be doing the opposite. It may be blocking. It kind of like insulin. Insulin is a good example, right? So insulin is very important, essential to bring glucose into the cells and block gluconeogenesis. But now if you have too much insulin, then you get insulin resistant, and then it does exactly the opposite of what you expect it to do, right? So it is not surprising. And we know there is IGF-1 resistance, and IGF-1 is key in building in the growth of any tissue, including muscle. So chances are that if you keep pushing the same receptors all the time, grow, at a certain point the system stops and says, okay, I refuse to do so. Also as a way to protect itself, because it cannot keep growing. So I think it's the way to do it is then to say, what is the lowest level of protein that allows me to maintain the mass that I desire, right? And also pay attention to the combination and the timing with the training. There's some arguments over what's the best, but multiple trials of now protein is sufficient together with one training session to maximize muscle building. So then even if you did that twice a day, it'll be 60 grams. And there's really no reason to do any more than that. So I would say if you did that, that will optimize muscle mass, potentially even in professional athletes. I mean, it will have to be tested, but certainly the clinical data suggests that's the way it is. And so then if you add on top of it the regenerative component, where the stem cells then are blocked by having all this protein all the time, then you really want to get to the minimum So you want to have the bricks, really, right? So you have to build, and so you need proteins as bricks to build the muscle, but you don't want to have so much of it that it actually has the opposite effect.
Yeah, that's really good advice. See, the audio cut out just a little bit, but you were saying, I mean, at most 60 grams of protein per day. I mean, is that what you're recommending even for athletic people?
Yeah, I would say 2 sessions of 30 grams together with the training. And now this is 30 grams of, I think the content of leucine is particularly important. So, it may be 35 if it's plant-based. And so, people will have to,
in that ballpark.
People will have to test it on themselves. If muscle is so important, then you might have to increase it a couple of grams and to optimize what somebody is comfortable with, and that's it, and stop at that level.
Brilliant. All right, well, I would love to transition to some more details of the Fasting Mimicry Diet and highlights from your book. And what I was surprised to learn about from reviewing some of the academic research is just 5 days out of, I believe, and it's been a few months since I read this one paper that you published, I think back in August, 5 days out of 30 that was the only therapy needed to actually have a statistically significant drop in IGF-1. Can you talk about, I mean, that's really easy for people to follow, just 5 days out of the month, adhere to this diet, and then eat ad lib the rest of the time. Were you surprised by that finding?
No. I mean, this is what we were going after, right? The idea that you can destroy damaged components of cells and cells, turn on stem cells, turn on the regeneration inside of a cell, and then replace bad cells with good cells, and this will last a long time. And that is what we've seen, not just for IGF-1, but for cholesterol, triglycerides, blood pressure, fasting glucose, inflammation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't think for the great majority of people, I think the average would be not once a month, but once every 3 to 4 months. And what I tell people is that the fasting mimicking diet should be done, until we know more about it, should be done only when you need to do it. And I would say most people need to do it once every 4 months. Now, some people need to do it once a month. So if you're obese and you have high cholesterol, high blood pressure, you probably need to do it once a month until you move to a different category. And so I think if you're a 32-year-old athlete and in perfect shape, and it has a pescatarian, a vegan fish plus fish diet, that you probably only need to do it twice a year if you're in perfect shape and exercise all the time, etc. So yeah, so I think that's a range, twice a year to once a month.
That's a really good tip. Intermittent fasting and doing prolonged water fasts and things like that are so popular now. And just like you said, I mean, you see healthy people that identify as biohackers are fasting all the time and exercising and working and trying to do all these things. And some people can inadvertently run themselves into the ground and be tired and fatigued and lose energy and things like that. So I'm glad that you underscored the point that if you have a disease of sorts you need to manage through lifestyle, that this is a great tool, but not everyone needs to do it all the time.
Yes, and first of all, the word intermittent fasting, it's just pointless. It doesn't mean anything. Just like the word intermittent eating doesn't mean anything. So what is it? 2 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, 12 days, 20 days? I mean, it's just, we should stop using words like intermittent fasting. It doesn't mean anything. And, start using precise words. Like when you talk about eating, you don't just say, well, if your eating is good for you, well, maybe not necessarily, right? So it's the same thing with fasting. What does it mean? Is it water only? If it's 6 hours, it's just a 6 hours fast. It's not an intermittent. Then how many times do you do it? Do you do it every day? You do it twice a week? And so I think even though it is complicated, but like we do it for food, eventually people learn about carbohydrates and proteins and vitamins and essential fatty acids. And we're starting to talk about something that is educated. And for example, most people that I talk to never heard, even some experts, by the way, never heard that if you go over 12 hours of fasting every day, you have up to a twofold increase in the chance you're going to need a gallbladder removed, right? And that's such a good, nice thing, right, to have. And people are very surprised, even doctors and even experts. Another thing that most people don't know about the so-called intermittent fasting, if you do if you go for 12 hours or more, if you skip breakfast and let's say there's a lot of advices on 16 hours, 18 hours fasting. So for most people, and that's usually not qualified, meaning they don't say do 16 hours and skip dinner, right? So for a lot of people, that means skipping breakfast. And most of the data out there indicates that skipping breakfast is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease and also increased overall mortality, right? So now you have two facts that are negative. Not only they're not positive, they're negative now. Increased gallstones and increased the cardiovascular and overall mortality. So this is just starting to emerge, but the point is that we need to understand that until we narrow it down and we qualify and say, here's what we're talking about. We're talking, say, the 5-day fasting mimicking diet. Okay, what is it being tested on? Is there animal testing? Are there epidemiological studies? Are there clinical studies? Good, bad. In this case, I think everything we know about it has been good. And we need to do this for all the different ones. And instead of calling everything intermittent fasting, start saying, okay, this is good. Like say 12 hours of time restricted feeding is very good for you, right? There is really no data against it. So if you eat, let's say 8 a.m., 8 p.m., that's good. But now if you're starting to get 14, 15, 16 hours, that's good and bad, right? So yeah, you may have some good up for it. And ketone bodies may go up a little bit. You might have some other advantage, probably some weight loss, or definitely some weight loss and some metabolic advantages. But then you're going to have increased risk of gallstone formation and potentially increased cardiovascular disease and overall mortality, right? So that's very important that people understand this. Another big mistake has been made, and it's all over the place, is this idea that you can feed ketone bodies and maybe fatty acids on top of a regular diet. And this is potentially problematic now, because now the system is being confused, and now you're going to have the basically metabolism trying to go two different directions. One is trying to go in a fasting response, but at the same time there is no fasting. There is glucose there, and so the system is also going to try to do that. And so this combination could be very problematic. And who knows, when you do that for 10, 15 years, what happens to somebody combining, a starvation response metabolism and a standard metabolism, all this for all these times.
Now, are you speaking more to the therapy, people using exogenous ketones, or people that are using MCT oil, or both, with a normal high carbohydrate diet?
Yeah, both. I mean, if you're using, let's say, ketone bodies or fatty acids, and at the same time you have a normal diet, now you're starting to push metabolism in two different directions. Now, it maybe that's okay, but it may be that it's not okay at all. I mean, the ketone bodies are usually very low if you're on a standard diet, and now so the body, it doesn't like to mix the two things. Otherwise, you probably have high ketone bodies and high glycolysis at the same time, all the time, but you don't, right? So what happens if you have either fatty acids or ketone bodies at high levels, and at the same time you have a normal glucose and normal also signals for glycolysis and other metabolic standard metabolic modes. I mean, my guess is the system is going to start breaking down. And you could think about, I always, in the book I talk about pillars, and you could think of a car, let's say a hybrid car that is electrical and there's got and it can use combustion, and imagine if all of a sudden you just push them both at the same time. I mean, I don't know, maybe some cars can do that, but I mean, if they're not made to do that, certainly you could see how it probably will break down, right? I mean, you can imagine if you keep doing and you just rewire the car so that it uses both at the same time without having an engineer reprogram it so that it can do that. I think it's got a good chance of breaking down.
I agree. Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. I think for a lot of people, including myself.
One thing I think people should keep in mind is that life, the expectancy right now for somebody who's just born is probably over 90 years, right? And somebody young, let's say, is 90 years. And so the removing that chance of having or potentially playing with the chance of having such a long lifespan by doing things that we have no idea if they even have the potential to extend life. That's a big, I think it's a big mistake.
Yeah, agree 100%. And I think a lot of people hear all the benefits of ketones, but they forget that ketones are energy molecules. And no one really gets excited about having high levels of blood glucose, yet people all over the internet are raving about having high levels of blood ketones as if it, I mean, there are positive brain effects, right? But no one gets excited about having too much energy in the system. We want energy to be utilized in muscle tissue and for the brain and so forth. So anyway, I think it's important, but can you highlight a little bit on this idea of fasting more than 12 hours and how that affects gallstone formation and thus may contribute or accelerate the risk of having someone's gallbladder damage and or removal?
Yeah, I mean, nobody knows, but I don't know the mechanisms. I mean, I'm not a gallbladder expert, but it just somehow contributes to the stones formation, maybe because some of the enzymes are not released, or maybe because there is accumulation of bile or other molecules in the gallbladder. But that's just a fact, right? Based on looking at thousands of people and asking the question, what is your eating habit, and just figuring out the ones that have, let's say, 16 hours, 18 hours consistent time between the last meal at night and the first meal in the morning. There's a very and there is a dose response, right? You see it going up from 14 to 16 to 18 to 20 hours or so.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I'm going to dive further into that research. I think that's something people should know about. So Valter, I know we're getting short on time here. Can we define, I don't think we have done that up to this point on this excellent discussion. I want to thank you for your time, but what is exactly, if you could define the fasting mimicry diet? I know you talk a lot about it in the book, but can you just kind of give the landscape of what that entails for people?
Yeah, the fasting mimicking diet is really, again, the result of all these years of research and understanding the connection between each component of food and these genes that regulate aging and regeneration, right? So essentially, the key points are the proteins, the sugars, less so the carbohydrates, and the fat and the type of fat. So you really have a low protein, but not only low protein, certain type of protein. So you make it low and you select the type based on the amino acid content. And then carbohydrates are low, but they're particularly low in sugar. And then the fats are high, but they're particularly high in certain type of fats, right? So I call it nutri-technology. Why? Because it's different from other food-based technology, because in this case, you're looking at the entire food content and what it does to the genes and the pathways in cells and so you can orchestrate these genes and pathways by having different content, and really it's about a balance of all these, right? So eventually you have to feed, and with the fasting mimicking diet, you also want to avoid malnourishment, you want to avoid hypotension, you want to avoid hypoglycemia. So you're really worrying about a lot of different things. Some of them have to do with regeneration, some have to do with visceral fat loss, some of them have to do with avoiding people ending up in the emergency room. And some of it has to do with compliance. Can people, are they going to be hungry all the time? And that's very important because, some of it has to do with taste, right? I mean, if it tastes terrible, people are not going to do it. So you put it all together, and I think eventually you come up with something that is fairly reasonable now. Tens of thousands of people have done the fasting mimicking diet, and thousands of doctors recommend it. So I think now we have a pretty good idea that it is feasible, it's safe, and it can be done by most people, not all people, but most people.
Yeah, and you provide a lot of the details and customization and so forth in the book, which I would highly recommend everyone listening to go out and get the Longevity Diet, which is fabulous. So we have a couple of final questions, Valter, that we've asked every guest. We're at episode 215 here. What's the first couple? This is a little bit more personal, not so much necessarily about the research, but we know you're out there really. I think Time Magazine had you on the cover. Was it November?
No, not me.
You on the cover of Time?
I had the story. Yeah, the story. Our work was featured in several Time Magazine feature stories, and one of them at least was a cover story.
Yeah, which is awesome. And I bring that up because you're really, shifting the pendulum and causing people to rethink different ideas about nutrition, and kind of you're shattering paradigms, old paradigms. So we want to know what you personally do in the morning. We know morning routines and rituals can carry over into life-changing careers and so forth. The first couple hours of your day, Valter, what does that look like for you?
You mean in terms of nutrition?
Do you get up? Do you meditate? Do you exercise? Do you do yoga? Do you walk? Do you do your research? We're just kind of curious to figure out what you do as a professional.
Yeah, no, I talk about this in the book, and actually what I've done is I have a bicycle, one of those stationary ones, and of course I ride a bike too when I can, but I figured out that there's too many excuses to not ride the bike around, even in California. And so I got one of the stationary one, and so I ride it at least 30-40 minutes every other day, no matter what. I mean, it's a routine that I stick with no matter what, and it helps to have it there. And then breakfast wise, I only have tea and some fruit preserve, and a whole lemon, usually black tea and green tea mixed together. So that's all I have every morning.
Oh, okay. And then how far between the tea and after the exercise, when is your first kind of real meal? Is it lunchtime?
Yeah, usually I wait to have breakfast until after the exercise. And so a lot of people ask me, because I tell them in the book about the 12 hours. And so people ask me, how do I do? I say, because they get up early and they're worried that there's not going to be enough time. So I say, maybe get up, do the exercise, and then have breakfast. And in some cases, people might have to go to work and have it at work. So I mean, obviously, you do have to have some compromises. And so I think waiting to have breakfast until 12 hours have passed since your last meal, it's a very, very good practice. Very important. Probably one of the most important things that you can do.
Yeah. I really agree with that, 100%. So Valter, if you were stranded on a desert island and there's only one food, phytonutrient, flavonoid, maybe dietary supplement that you can bring with you, what would you bring and why?
A supplement, well, so the food that will be available, I can bring a supplement.
Or just one thing. We're curious to find maybe what your favorite or your go-to pick for a health substance would be. A lot of people say curcumin, resveratrol, magnesium. Some people say turmeric root. What would you bring with you?
I would bring garbanzo beans. A ton of garbanzo.
Do you soak them?
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, the protein,
Great.
the nourishment, the taste, the fact that they're so popular in so many cultures. Yeah, so I think that's one of the close to perfect foods. And I mean, not for everybody, obviously, but I would say that that's certainly a good one.
That's awesome. We've asked a lot of healthcare practitioners the same question, Valter, and no one's said any legume or bean of any sort. So I'm glad you brought that out there, because there's so much with Stephen Gundry's work and the plant paradox and lectins. There's a lot of people scared about legumes and beans. So I appreciate you opening up.
And this is one of the pillars in the book. If you go around the world, as I have, and visit Okinawa, Loma Linda, Sardinia, Calabria, all the places, they're very different, from Okinawa to Costa Rica to Loma Linda, California. One thing they all have in common is a lot of beans, right? And they have record longevity. So you have to wonder, if they all have this one thing in common, it probably is pretty good for you. And for example, in my town in Calabria that I talk about in the book, people used to have, something called pasta bayonne. I actually have the picture in it, 5 or 6 times a week. And in Okinawa, legumes less so, but the very frequent use of beans in all these areas, but including Okinawa. So I think it's very important to not, again, like it's been done for everything, demonize a product because you do some experiments and some people are sensitive to it. That's fine. I mean, obviously some people can be develop autoimmunities, they may develop intolerances, etc., to legumes, and those people like gluten, right? So it's a good example. I mean, high levels of gluten, and especially in some people, in a small percentage of the people, can cause a lot of problem. But low levels of gluten in most people are fine. So yeah, so that's the kind of understanding I think that we need to separate something bad from something maybe bad at high level and in a particular format.
Brilliant. I really appreciate you bringing that advice. The final question here, there's a lot of talk about healthcare reform, the cost of healthcare, improving, increasing allocation towards prevention and so forth. So with that in mind, if you were in an elevator with a politician that was trying to improve the health of some sort of jurisdiction or maybe the United States or another country, and you just had 30 seconds to share with them one lifestyle or health tip that you feel would have a sweeping change on the health of a large number of people, what sort of nutrition tip would you want them to know about?
Yes, I actually had 2 meetings with the Minister of Health in Italy recently. I've been trying to do the same here in the US. And I mean, by far, the number one tip would be a fasting mimicking diet. There is no doubt, particularly because it comes in a package and the doctor is involved, or a nutritionist or a dietitian is involved, and it's very straightforward. It doesn't force you to revolutionize your life. And so we clearly shown in the clinical trial how effective it is for a variety of problems. And now we're calculating the number of years it rejuvenates you and the effect on the risk of developing diseases, the 10-year risk. But we suspect from at least the initial analysis, there's going to be a tremendous effect. So I think that if I was talking to a politician, I would say, particularly considering that people we're seeing are very much willing to do. I think in the clinical trial, we only had about 5% of people dropping out because of the food. So that means that if they didn't have to pay for it, if the government actually or a company reimbursed it and said, I'll give you 4 of these boxes per year, that probably 90 to 95% of people will do it. And the savings could be tremendous, I think, human wise, but also dollars wise.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So along those lines, if folks want to embark on the fasting mimicry diet and learn more information about that, how do they go about doing that?
Well, in the original version, in the Italian book, I have it in the US book too, but in the US book, I basically say, look, we've gone out and told people you have an option of doing it with your dietitian, etc. And we realized it was a disaster. A lot of people ending up in the emergency room or in the doctor's office, because when you allow something so powerful to be done at home, and people trying to understand how much of that, how much of this, let me cook it up. It's very complex. And so now I'm saying, I think it should be done with the prolonged fasting mimicking diet sold by Alnutra. I assigned all my shares to a nonprofit. I don't take any consulting from them, so I don't make a penny out of this. Everything is going back to research, the universities, and so we can keep doing the research. And the price is very limited, especially if you do it 3 or 4 times a year. Also, keeping in mind that on average, I think an American spends, $160, $170 a week in food. And so the difference between what somebody will spend on food and drinks on 5 days and what the box cost, I think is very small. So that's another reason I think it's better to just do it safely and do it with what's being clinically tested, and just do it that way. But of course, the book also has enough information that if somebody wanted to take a chance, they could do it. I mean, I didn't want to make it sound like we're keeping the secret so that everybody has to go buy this product, But I think it's just a very bad idea to do it the other way.
So what I heard you say is the way that you recommend is work with a healthcare practitioner, get the product through them under their guidance if they want to do the box or the kit. Is that what you're saying?
No, only if you have a disease or if you have some conditions, like if you're anorexic or something like that, yeah, then absolutely you shouldn't do it, or you should go talk to a doctor and see if for some reason you should do it. Now, if you don't have a disease, then you don't need to go through medical supervision, but you should probably. We advise that you should talk to a dietitian and just get general information about things to look out for and the best way to do it. And I think the company provides that. If somebody doesn't want to get their own dietitian included in the cost of the product.
Sure. Wonderful. Well, Valter, thanks so much for coming on the show. Commend you for all the great work that you're doing and launching the book and so forth. I wish you much success with that. And again, the book is The Longevity Diet. Any final words or parting advice? I think there's a delay.
The book covers it all.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, Valter. Thanks so much. Hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.